morning. I am Brent. I'm coming to you today from our little farm called Valley View Acres, which is about 2 miles west of Logan, Utah. I'm here today to begin part 2 of our series on how I grow my garden. Part 1, we covered a lot of the preliminary things that go on before we actually start planting in the garden. I showed you the greenhouse and my dungeon and some places where I start my seed. In this section, part 2, we're going to be covering how we plant and how we harvest our garden. Now, we've been a little bit slow in getting going this year because here in Cache Valley, we had a really hard winter this year. We had record-breaking snows that have never been seen before. As you can see on the mountains back here behind me, there's still a lot of snow in the mountains back there, but the snow has finally melted here in the valley floor and dried out enough that we were able to get ready to start planting. So we're going to move back up to our home where we do most of our gardening in the garden there, and we will start today by planting peas. So we'll see you up at the garden. This is my garden. I introduced you to this in part 1, and I explained then that in the fall I put a lot of organic matter into my garden and till it in. And I like to do that. It loosens the soil as well as gives organic matter into the soil. What you're seeing out here now is what has accumulated during the winter in the garden. I've mentioned several times about all the snow we received last winter, and because of all of that snow, I haven't been able to get out here and do any spring tilling. While I've been waiting for it to dry out, however, I've got the raspberries trimmed and the grapes trimmed and some of the trees trimmed and ready to go. Finally, yesterday, I felt it was dry enough to do some tilling so that I could get my peas in. They're one of the first things that I usually like to plant. Today is actually April the 29th. I usually get my peas in anywhere after March 15th, so you can see that we are late this year, but that's okay. We have plenty of time for the peas. So I like to plant my peas along a fence. So you see this little fence that I have put in here. This particular fence is just made out of half-size panels, farming panels that they use, and they work really good for the peas. Before I had these, I just used a little fence that I put in, and before that I didn't even use anything. I just let them grow on the ground. But as I've got older and had more experience, I have found that the peas do better if I put them on a fence, and they're also easier to pick that way. So I plant mine on the fence. So I'll come over now and show you how I do this. I usually plant 2 different kinds of peas. I plant a green arrow pea and then an early frosty. I do half of my row with one and half with the other. So let me show you how I do this. First of all, after I've got the fence up, I'll make a little row, a little trough right here. And then when I plant my peas, I plant on both sides of the fence. I try to put a pea about every inch. I don't measure or anything, I just scatter them along there. Like that. Once I've got the whole row done, then I'll come back along and cover them. And then I don't know why I do it, but then after I've covered it, I like to come along and just walk on top of it. That kind of packs it down. And that's the way that I planned them. After I've planted them, I'll take the hose and sprinkle them so that they stay moist. And then in the next week or 2, I'll try to keep them moist. Some days I'll have to water every day, depending on the weather. Sometimes I might go 2 or 3 days between watering. But I try to keep them moist until they germinate and come up. Peas is one of our family's favorite crops, and so we plant a lot of them. So we have a long row of peas. I'm done planting. I've got both sides of the fence covered with seeds. Now I'll go along and cover them up and walk on it, and then all we have to do is water them and look forward to around the 4th of July to eating some delicious peas. Today we're going to plant carrots and beets. A couple of things that I like to do before I plant these two vegetables is to freshly till the ground, and then I will rake it out so that it's nice and smooth. Then on either side of the center line of my row, I'll put a string about 6 inches off the center line. This gives me a nice wide row, and as I plant, I'll try to spread the seeds within that foot area. Once the plants come up, I thin them out, and then I have a nice thick row, but also I have a wide row, and it takes more advantage of the space that I have limited. So if in your garden you're limited in space, you might consider either planting wide rows or even planting it in a little block so that you can take advantage of the space that you've got. Well, I mentioned that I just scatter the seed around in here, as I don't want it to be too thick, and so I just scatter them. After these come up, I'll thin them out. What I'm planting today is called a Nance carrot, and it works pretty well in our heavy clay soils here in northern Utah. And I don't have to be too fussy on this because, like I said, I'm going to thin these out. After I have planted that, then I like to take and cover it with about 1/4 of an inch of soil. These seeds are quite small, so you don't want them to be very deep. If they're too deep, they have a hard time germinating. Okay, and then after I've got them covered with soil, then what I like to do is come along and put some grass clippings on them. These grass clippings will help hold the moisture in. And over the years, I've had a little bit of trouble with carrots germinating because they seem to dry out so fast because they're not planted deep, and then they are such a small seed. And so the grass clippings will help to hold this moisture in. And that's how I plant my carrots. So I'll go ahead and finish the rest of the row, and if you like this method, good luck to you on doing it. We're now ready to plant our beets. The preparation for the beets is very similar to that of the carrots. We tilled the garden so that the soil would be nice and soft, and then I raked it out so that it would be smooth, and then I ran the strings 6 inches off my center line, just like I did the carrots. This way, as I plant the beets, I'll have a nice wide row, and when I thin them out, I'll thin them down to about 1 to 2 inches apart for the plants, and then that'll give the beets room to grow. And the beet that we're planting today is a Ruby Queen, and this is a beet that I've quite liked for several years, and that's what we'll be planting today. With these, I'll scatter them along just like we did with the carrots. They don't have to be very thick because, like I said, we're going to thin them down. Now, one of the big differences between the beets and the carrots is that when we cover these, we will cover these to about 1/2 of an inch. Probably no more than that, but about 1/2 of an inch, because the beet seed is much larger than the carrot seed, and we won't put any grass on the beet seed either, because since it's buried a little deeper, they have a tendency to hold their moisture enough for them to germinate. So let's go ahead and cover these up. I just do it the same way as I do with the carrots. I just put a little bit more on. Okay, I'll go ahead and finish the row. After I've got the row done, like I did with the peas, I'll walk on it to just kind of mash it down a little bit, and then I'll go ahead and water it so that it'll stay moist. All of these things that we've been doing, the peas and the carrots and the beets, these are all early spring crops, and they can take a little bit of cold if we get it. It's quite warm right now, so we're not worrying too much about it. But they do need to be kept moist in order to germinate. So we'll go ahead and finish our row and get it watered up. Good afternoon. We're back today for another day of planting. Today is May the 2nd, and today we're going to be planting onions. Some of you that watched part 1 of this series on how I prepare my garden saw that I start a lot of my plants down in my dungeon under my house under lights. This is some of the onions that I started down there, and I started these on February the 6th, and they will sprout down in the dungeon under the lights, and then once they get big enough, I'll move them down to our little farm called Valley View Acres, where we have a greenhouse, and I will put the onions in the greenhouse until I'm ready to put them outside. Today we're going to be planting 4 different kinds of onions. And I've probably mentioned this before, but the kind that I plant work well for me here in northern Utah. The kind that you plant might be different in the area where you're living. So check around and find out what works best for you. Today we'll be planting one called a Utah Yellow, which is a Spanish onion. We'll be planting Candy and also Walla Walla. And then we like a red onion that's called a red Burgermaster. So we'll be planting those 4 different kinds. We'll be doing about a 15-foot row of each of those onions. So let's get down in the dirt and see how these go. We're ready to start planting here. I got a little bit of the row started already, but what I usually do when I'm planting, I run a string down the middle. And then, as I mentioned, when we planted the carrots and the beets, I like to kind of conserve my space. So what I actually end up with is 4 rows compacted into about a foot wide area. So I'll come along off my string here, and I'll do 2 rows that side and 2 rows this side. A couple of tools that I like to use is I'll have a little stick that's about 6 inches long, and then my little gardening spade. And then sometimes a stick or this railroad spike works well. If the ground is a little bit moist, you can just poke that in the ground and wiggle it around, and it'll leave a hole, and then you can stick the onion in that. But today, since I've recently tilled, the ground is too soft to do that, so we'll be planting with our spade. So what I do is I get my onions. These ones are some of the Utah Yellow Spanish onions. And you got to just kind of be cruel with them a little bit and break them apart. And then I'll take my little stick and I'll put that in there and get 6 inches. I'll come about 2 inches off my string, dig a hole, put it in. And the thing that's important right at this stage is you don't want that onion to be too deep. As they grow, the top part of the bulb is actually out of the ground, so you don't want to plant them too deep. And then in between those 2, I'll come out another 2 or 3 inches and dig another hole and put one in. And this isn't really rocket science, so I kind of do a lot of guessing. I use my little stick once in a while to keep me honest, but I can come over here and that 6 inches is about halfway between these 2 onions. So I can pretty much just guess where it goes. It'll go right there, and I can put it in. these onions, starting them from seed the way I do, they've got a pretty good set of roots on them already. And I like that better than I do getting the little bundles from the nursery that are dry. Now both will produce a good onion, but I have had a lot better success starting my own onion sets from seed. And so these have all been started from seed, and I've had really good luck with it. I get nice big onions and they store well during the winter. So I'll come down here, my measured amount, put one in. I'll just guess here in between them. Put one in. Come over here to the other side. I need to catch up my fourth row over here. So I'll just keep doing that, work my 4 rows down to the end. Like I said, I'm going to do about a 15-foot row of each of the 4 different kinds that I named. Last year, off of this same amount, I probably got around 150 to 200 pounds of onions. So it has worked really well for me, and I hope it does for you. See you on our next item. Today we're going to finish up our cool season crops. We're going to plant some Swiss chard and some cabbage. Now, I like to plant Swiss chard. It's very similar to spinach, but the Swiss chard seems to grow better in our area, and we kind of like the flavor of it a little better. So we do the Swiss chard, but you might just like to do spinach. Either one of those are good for you and a good crop. With the Swiss chard though, we plant it similar to the beets and the carrots, but it gets planted a little deeper. So I've taken and scraped the soil back a little bit where I'm going to plant the Swiss chard, and then we scatter it around. And again, we don't want these to be too close to each other, because the habit of the Swiss chard is it grows and you can cut it off and eat it, and then it grows back again. And so you don't need the plants to be too close to each other. So we'll just scatter the seed around in our little area here. I'll only do part of the row here so that you can see what we're doing. But again, we don't want these seeds too close to each other. After we've got them there, then we'll just take this soil that we've had and we'll just bring it. We want about 1 inch of soil on top of the Swiss chard. Okay, we got that all covered the way we would like it, and so we can just pat that down a little. And Swiss chard grows pretty fast. It's one of the earlier harvest crops that you can harvest. And then, like I said, when you cut it, I used to go in and be selective of the leaves, but now I pretty much just go in and cut the whole thing off, and then a new set of leaves will come up from it. So that's the way we do the Swiss chard. So we'll just change our camera angle and we'll do our cabbage. These cabbage plants are some that I started down in my dungeon. Looking at the date on these, I started these about the middle of March, and it's now the 6th of May, and so they've been growing for a little while. They're pretty nice, healthy looking plants. And so to plant these, I've measured off my distance. I usually like to do 18 inches to 24 inches between the plants. I'm doing 18 this year just because that fit my row the best. So when I plant these, I dig a little hole, and then I'll take the plant and I'll try to plant it at about the same depth that it is in its little cell here. So I want the soil to be about at that level right there. Now there's a lot of different kinds of cabbage. that are really good out on the market. I've kind of settled in on Copenhagen. It's a cabbage that doesn't seem to split as much as the other cabbages, and it does well in our climate. But one thing you have to do is with Copenhagen or any of the other cabbages, when they're ready, you need to pick them, because they don't stay very long before they will start to split and deteriorate. Another one that I'm going to try this year is one that somebody recommended to me. It's called a Golden Ace, and I don't know how that one's going to work, but so this year we're going to do the Copenhagen and the Golden Ace. So again, we'll dig our little hole. Need to make sure we have it deep enough, but not too deep. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and finish the rest of the row here. I mentioned that this is about the last of the spring crops that we try to get in. We do like to get our potatoes in sometime in the near future, but they take a long time to sprout, so even if we get them in now, they probably won't be sprouting until it's closer to time for the warmer crop things to go in. So we will get back with you when we start the other crops.